Hi, everyone. Welcome to our, I believe it's eighth Facebook Live. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Linet Mera. I'm the executive director of the Unconscious Bias Project. We're a small nonprofit in the Bay Area, California. What we do is we bring creative solutions to bias and unconscious bias to workplaces and classrooms. This video, like several others in the series, are part of the Together Against Bias series, where we're examining the racism, xenophobia, and health inequities that have been worsened during the pandemic and bring you action items, bring awareness, and try to help us come together as a community, because community is how we are able to fight these problems and how we're able to change and hold each other accountable. So I have a lot of topics to cover today. First off, I want to say thank you so much for being on this journey with us. It's relatively new for UBP to be out here online on social media so much. And we're really grateful for everybody that has made that possible. So thank you. So of the topics I wanted to talk about today, one, I wanted to talk about colorism in the Latinx communities. I want to talk about queer power and how queer folks have been central to a lot of big changes and movement in the Black Lives Matter movement. I also want to talk about what we're doing at UBP and what changes and offerings we're going to have coming really soon. So let's get some of that. Sorry, I'm just going to mute my phone. We're just going to get the UBP stuff completed. So at UBP, we're going to take the next 3 months or so to really spend some time reflecting on how we want to change how we're engaging with our communities, what our potential impacts could be now that we're bringing everything online, how we want to broaden our reach, how we're going to transform our in-person interactive active learning workshops to something that won't exhaust you from hours of staring at the screen. We still want to bring you evidence-based action to take home. And so we're looking for ways in which we can do that. So we'll be taking a break from our lives. And that doesn't mean that we're not working really hard. So in the meantime, I'm going to leave you some resources that we think could be really helpful for you at this time of Black Lives Matter. So for Black Lives Matter, this movement has really made a lot of us to, force ourselves to reckon with the embedded history and societal constructs that were left behind, or not left behind, that were left sort of ingrained into everything that we have, basically everything that we have as a nation, rooted in slavery and colonialism. So I don't have Selena today, but I'm just going to post our website. Our Black Lives Matter statement is posted on there, and that contains several links on how we're reflecting on the movement and what our stance, what our actions are with respect to racism and anti-racism. So colonialism, slavery, they sound like things that happened a long time ago, but any of you folks that have been following us along so far know that these sort of systems of how we interact with each other, the ways in which even our language carries that culture of oppression, has really changed the way we do almost everything. And this is why the Black Lives Matter movement is so important. And it's why it is so important to take a chance right now. Everybody's paying attention. Everybody's doing their best to learn more, to really examine themselves, I hope, and what their role is, what actions they can take in their personal lives, in their work, at home with families, and with grandparents even, what we can do collectively in our communities to advocate for change. There's a lot of people talking about defunding the police. And just a little tidbit I want to insert here. If you've heard about defunding the police, the idea isn't, well, let's just run amok and declare anarchy and there will be no safety for anybody. And, people are going to be, I don't know, shooting everybody up everywhere. That's not exactly what defunding police means. Defunding police movement that's part of, and maybe in parallel to, the Black Lives Matter movement is really asking us to question what the role of a police person is when they are interacting with people in the community. When you bring lethal force, that's guns, so things that can literally kill somebody in seconds, less than a second, does it make sense to bring that lethal force when you're seeking help? Say, you've just had a mental breakdown and you need help. Do you need somebody with a gun there? Say, there's been an intruder and they're taking something out of your house. Do you really need a gun? It's sort of asking these questions, forcing us to really think of, what are the folks that have been getting literally murdered? Is it really, would, I don't know, stealing a TV really be worth a life? These are the tough questions that we have to really ask ourselves. It doesn't mean that police may not have a role in our society, or that that all cops are terrible. It means that the way the system is set up, the way we've decided that police play a role in our society, is probably no longer what we actually need. And if our governmental systems are meant to serve the people, and the people are saying that this particular system is either not doing its job, or is actually harming so many of its citizens, so many Black lives, that it's become the status quo for a Black person to fear just even being, you can't even be in your own home, right, Breonna Taylor? Then we have to re-examine that. We have to come to the table and really think for others. If you're not being affected by police violence, if your community has not been affected by police violence, listen to those communities that are. Listen to Black and brown lives. Listen to people in the disability activism community. They've been asking us, they've been imploring us, they've been trying to educate us about these problems for a really long time. So just take this opportunity, take this time to try not to bring up your concern, your immediate concern, like, oh, I'm a business owner, I need police protection, or I have valuables in my home, or I've never had a bad interaction with a police person, so why would you even consider this? Just really try to move aside your initial reaction and engage in that learning and in that trusting of their voices. Black folks, brown folks, people with disabilities wouldn't be talking about this, spending so much time and effort, so much grief, so much work into creating these movements, into thinking about these problems and really researching them, if it wasn't real, right? Okay. So that so this is really an opportunity. That's what I'm trying to urge you, is this is really an opportunity. We did some reflection internally on what we've done and how we've shown up for anti-racism. At the Unconscious Bias Project, we live and breathe, how can we translate the ideal principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion into the real world, into something that we can tell somebody, okay, first do this, now do this, then apply this, and continue doing that and engage in self-exploration and all that. How do we make that a reality? And we realize that we have not been weighing in, aside from this year, we have not really been weighing in on true tragedies of Black lives being lost, and that's on us, and that's something that we can change. We have also possibly, very likely, not done as much as possible to really reach out and collaborate with fellow Black, Brown, and First Nations folks out there that are doing similar work, to see how we can support each other. And we're changing that. Sort of, these are the kinds of exercises that I hope you all, as individuals and as organizations, are engaging in. On a personal level, with my kid, I have a 3-year-old. I was very aware and active in trying to talk about gender and pushing trying to break and trying to push apart the misogyny that's such a strong part of Latinx culture or Latina culture. And why? Because these rigid ideas of what masculinity and femininity are really not only constraining our children and their futures, but are really sort of the core of when we get problems with violence and lack of respect towards women. So this had always been really important to me. And once Black Lives Matter protests started happening, I realized that even though I'd made efforts to make sure that my kids' play dates he had diverse friends, and that they would see diverse people in any sort of, I know, yes, YouTube videos, but YouTube videos that they saw, that I needed to do more. And I looked at, so I read to my kid in 3 languages, I know. And I looked at all their books in Spanish, and all of their books in Spanish feature only light-skinned protagonists. And I realized I needed to do more, right? It starts from home. It starts with each other. It starts with our community. So I'm taking this opportunity to teach more in my family, my own family, and to actually, step in and actually act and say something with my elders and people that I respect that are part of my community, because it is a full cycle, right? Community doesn't just mean other people like me. Community means my neighbors, my extended family, my friends. Okay. The next topic I wanted to talk about is Toni McDade. So for folks that don't know, Toni McDade was a Black trans man who lost his life, or not lost his life, who was killed by police only 2 days after George Floyd was murdered. And I wanted to read you a reflection from a Black trans man on his experience going through the Black Lives Matter protests and trying to sort of give his perspective, giving his perspective on why it's so important to recognize the trans lives that have been erased, really, by all different parts of the system, by the way reporting happens, that, they like literally just look at gender assigned at birth, and that's what goes into the police file or goes into the news. So initially, Toni McDade was misgendered when the article came out about his passing or his death. And I just wanted to read you a little bit from, this is from Lazarus, their blog page. And he says, I'm not sure how many die-ins, vigils, or marches I have done for Black lives, but I know none have been organized specifically by and for my Black trans siblings that we lose to white supremacist violence. I spent a year of my life on a master's thesis exploring the rights, R-I-T-E-S, and rights of mourning trans lives in this country and the history of Transgender Day of Remembrance. I track the steady but sure reality that every year in this country, over 80% of names we read are trans people of color, a vast majority of them Black trans women and femmes. I know the lists are forever incomplete, and we hold space for those we don't know. I watch LGBTQ plus organizations with lily white executive boards somberly dash the words intersectionality and anti-Blackness in relation to transphobia, paying lip service for truths they don't have to live. Every year, I wonder why the crowd isn't bigger at these vigils. My relation to Black violence and death at the hands of police shifted as my gender presentation did. No Black body is safe from police brutality, but the coverage that Black cis men get makes it seem that they are the most at risk. And I am grateful for folks finally bringing Breonna Taylor's story to light 3 months after her murder at the hands of police. It took one day for George. Okay, and I'm gonna skip to later. I just want to take a pause there and recognize we have talked about Breonna Taylor. We've talked about George Floyd. There is, there's nobody's perfect. It doesn't mean that we can't do something about it, right? And so folks in the Black Lives Matter movement, people that are protesting right now, if you're taking action, if you're signing petitions, if you're donating, thank you. And we urge you to think about trans Black lives too. So I'll keep on reading. Toni McDade was shot and killed by Tallahassee PD on May 27th, and I learned the news from a single Twitter screenshot that originally misgendered him. The poster was complaining that they'd seen no news on this murder because the victim wasn't a Black cis man. When they learned he wasn't a woman, they seemed to lose interest, while trans celebrities became the main voices demanding justice. I'm going to skip a little bit. Friends and family lovingly called him Tony the Tiger and recalled that he was big-hearted. Tony is not the perfect victim. No Black person is in this nation's eyes. The further we are removed from white supremacists' heteropatriarchal value-based system, the less our death seems to matter. And being Black and trans is a double affront to white supremacy. Kimberly Crenshaw, the badass theorist and activist that gifted us with the model of intersectionality decades ago, created the Say Her Name to highlight the disparity in mourning only Black cis male victims of police brutality, highlighting this gap in recognizing victims other than Black cis men. I found myself wanting to use the hashtag Say His Name for Tony to capture the matrices of violence that led to his murder, and to try and push back at all of the dead naming and misgendering that added to the violence of his murder. But it didn't feel enough. So again and again, I add hashtag Black Trans Lives Matter to every post and plea I make. So I think this is a really important thing to discuss. A lot of our trans folks that are out there get erased, get forgotten. And it's not just in the news pieces, it's in our health systems, it's in our social services, it's in, just official registries for anything. It's in driver's licenses. Nobody chooses to be trans and face discrimination, dead naming, and misgendering at every turn. So the more we recognize, learn from, accept, and embrace their reality, the sooner we can get towards equity, the sooner we can get towards inclusivity. We recently recorded a podcast with Alexis Crone, who's on our team, and we talked about how difficult it always was, right, to be trans in any space, but how there are really just few pockets in the world that are actually truly inclusive. And she shared with me when she first came out to her colleagues, and this is on a podcast, so I'm not outing anyone. She shared this on this podcast that she came out to her colleagues and she got so much of, oh, you're the first trans person I've ever met. And that experience of you're the only one I've never recognized, I've never met, I've never opened myself to another trans person is, I'll let you hear her story in the podcast. But she moved to the Bay Area to be somewhere where she wasn't the only one, right? We're one of the many reasons why she moved. Please check out the podcast. It's going to be really great. And we're launching that hopefully end of June. So please look forward to that. And we talked also about how hard it was already as a trans woman to seek healthcare because of it's so common to be dead named and misgendered just in the process of intake. So if you go to a hospital, if you go to a pharmacy, you need to, talk with somebody, call somebody, and if they are aware, they'll take clues and maybe ask pronouns, right? If you're in person. But if you're on the phone and you have to give your, government ID information, and you're also giving your real name and your identity, there can be this moment of confusion and conflict that you have to, time and time again, either take somebody through the recognition of like, yes, my voice sounds male and I am a trans woman. Every single time, there is a very big emotional cost. One of the things that Alexis has recently said to me is, if we're ever hanging out together, okay, post coronavirus, of course, if we're ever hanging out together, please be the one to order pizza. Because in the service industry, much like in healthcare, people are trained to say ma'am or sir, right? So where is somebody that might have a more bass tone voice? Where are they going to, what choices do they have? They're going to be immediately called sir. But what if they're a woman? What if they're they? What if they don't identify with or feel comfortable with those kinds of pronouns, what recourse is there then? Right? So it's a sort of like constant battle. And during coronavirus, it's so much harder. A lot of um, queer folk were already in spaces like service industry and gig economy. And with the economic downturn, many of them are faced with worse economic outcomes than their cis heteronormative counterparts. In addition, seeking healthcare, seeking help if they start presenting symptoms. Do you really want to go? You're sitting there, you can't breathe, you have really high fevers. Do you really want to add on top of that being dead named and misgendered? Having your whole identity questioned on top of fighting an illness? Probably not. This is why it's so important that we recognize our queer folks in any movements, in any emergency preparedness, in just everything that we're doing. Oh, and I meant to post more links. There are, so for Toni McDade, there are petitions asking for justice for Toni. And there's also a place where you can donate directly to their family as they're seeking justice. I highly recommend you support them. Lastly, another action item that you can have is to donate to the Freedom Fund, which is an LGBTQ bail fund for jails as well as queer folks in immigration detention centers. So personal action items you could do for yourself, thinking and centering Black and Brown queer lives is to really pay attention and amplify the stories and voices of queer Black and Brown folks. Also, if you meet somebody who doesn't go by, the pronouns you would expect, just simply ask, offer, maybe ask their friend, state your own pronouns. Adding your pronouns at the end of your email signature goes a really long way in your public profiles, in your social media. And just because you put your pronouns out there should be no expectations that they would have to do the same. But it gives that space, it allows that space for them to be who they are, as opposed to trying to fit in or decide, do I engage right now? Do I try to hide? Do I need to fight an uphill battle just to participate in a conversation? So these are all things we can do. And much like we've discussed in previous lives, speak up and act if you see a microaggression or an overt aggression towards somebody who's Black, and definitely if they're Black and queer. And what can you do? All you have to do is just be there at the very least. If you can intervene safely, do so. We've posted links for how to safely record police action in the past, and we really recommend you check it out. Lastly, one thing I wanted to add about queer power and queer power and the Black Lives Matter movement is, for those folks who don't know their history, which, by the way, I really recommend you check out and start learning about the history of activism all around the world, and definitely in the US. You'll find that queer folk are often at the center of change. So check out and learn about Marsha P Johnson. She is credited as one of the first people to throw a brick at the Stonewall riots. I highly recommend you check her out. she and several trans folks, gay folks, and drag queens in the queer community were really the force for action for change that led to a lot of gay rights. So we need to consider them, embrace them, and amplify them within this movement as well. All right, on to the next topic. And talking about erasure, I want to talk a little bit about colorism in the Latinx community. So what is colorism? Colorism is let's say a prejudiced preference for lighter skinned people over darker skinned people. So if you didn't know, the Latinx community has all the colors of the rainbow. You can be, the most obsidian skinned person and be Colombian. Yeah, Colombian, like me. I'm Colombian. And you can be pale, pale as heck, like me, and be Colombian. And there's all a spectrum in between. And unfortunately, in most Latin American countries and in most Latin American communities and European Spanish communities, there is clear racism against darker skinned people, even if you speak the same language, even if you share the same culture, even if you share, the same hometown, there is a preference. And if you ask for evidence, all I ask for you is to look at who are the leaders of these different countries and who have they been over time. As the Latinx community, fortunately here in California, in Arizona, New Mexico, there is a strong history of the Chicanx movement being closely tied and very supportive and of Black Lives Matter. And this has been going for a long time. And, a lot of Chicanx know that it's time to show up. It's time to act with their Black Lives Matter counterparts to support this movement. And that is an amazing thing to behold. And there are still people in the Latinx community that ascribe to the colonial slave owner, me versus them power dynamic that keep on erasing, oppressing, removing our Black Latinx voices from the table. So, in addition to being Latinx, you're also being discriminated against for having darker skin. That's a double or even triple penalty. And you might say, well, that's an old thing. It's not. I actually know somebody in my family who went out for a job hunt in Bogota, Colombia, and was discriminated against at almost every single job interview and has been made to feel completely othered. So this is something like alive and well. And so as a Latinx community, as Latinx parents, we need to examine and really come to terms with this true and very impactful, painful history that we have, tied with Spanish colonialism and slavery, and come to the table and question things that are so integral to some of our cultures. In Colombia, for example, during Carnaval, there is blackface that is a very common part of Carnaval. It's a very specific character in the story, and it's people will defend it and say, no, it's a historical thing. It's celebrating, the liberation of Black slaves, except, and probably folks that are listening to this don't need to know this, but already know this. Blackface is never okay, and we can only really engage in celebrating like this when Black Latinx folks are offered the same resources, the same opportunities, can have seats of power, are not continuously being oppressed, discriminated, and shunned as their lighter skinned counterparts. So I'm sorry, Dios, tías, we have to embrace this. And one thing that's specific to, a lot of Latinx countries, Latina countries like Colombia, is that we don't have a lot of history that we can point to. Like my great great grandmother was this, my great great grandfather was that, and so most of us are mixed. I am mixed. I took a DNA test. Turns out I'm 100% nothing at all. I am mixed, and that is something that I'm very aware of, but I don't know what's all out there. And so I think there's a tendency in Latinx families to decide that we are descendants from Spaniards, or we are 100% whatever, and we're, by doing this kind of whitewashing and ignoring the violent history that's really the foundation of where a lot of these countries were built. We are buying into the colonial mentality. We're buying into the slave owner mentality by allowing that power dynamic to continue. Okay, that was pretty heavy. And I encourage, my Latinx parents, my Latinx friends out there, have this discussion with your families. I know it can be really hard to talk with family members. There's a lot of really strong feelings around this stuff. And I just want you to be brave. Just take that first step and ask, hey, what do you think about these protests that are happening? And just start with that. Just start with an easy conversation and be vocal. It doesn't mean you have to be harsh or angry or, completely disown, whatever, tío, tía, or cousin. You just have to start these conversations. Now is the time. We're all at home. Reach out, call them, and just talk. Okay, and with that, we'll be taking a break until early August. So many hugs to all of you. Please be safe. Please wear masks. And we'll see you soon.